Back in November of 2020, after reading about Chancellor Rishi Sunak's spending review and the eye-watering amounts of government debt we have built up as a result of the response to COVID-19, I have come to the conclusion that the UK government are spending far too much of our money, and that moral crusade of trying to get us to spend ever more is becoming a greater and greater problem. I was painfully reminded of both a passage from the Bible and an article I read earlier that month about the footballer turned political lobbyist, and anointed Christ-like figure, Marcus Rashford. Firstly, the following line from the Bible is from the Gospel of Matthew, verse 26 chapter 11, in which Jesus says, "The poor you will always have with you." Moving from the Bible to an equally strident publication, the article written by Haroon Siddique in the Guardian newspaper on the 8th of November 2020 reads, Marcus Rashford forces Boris Johnson into second U-turn on child food poverty. The PM called the footballer on Saturday night to confirm latest about-face for the government. On the day his political soulmate was being urged to belatedly show some humility after defeat in the US election, Boris Johnson once again bowed to the better judgment of a 23-year-old footballer, in the latest of a series of high-profile U-turns. After weeks of digging in his heels and refusing to cede to calls to extend free school meals to children from low-income families during school holidays in England, Johnson phoned the Manchester United and England footballer Marcus Rashford on Saturday night to inform him of his change of heart. The package includes a £170 million COVID winter grant scheme to support vulnerable families in England and an extension of the holiday activities and food programme to the Easter, summer, and Christmas breaks next year. The reversal came after a crescendo of criticism, led by Rashford, but also from charities, the opposition, media on both sides of the political divide and even some Conservative MPs, who realised how out of tune their party was with the public mood. It was the second time the Manchester United star had forced the government to change course this year. On the previous occasion, which last month earned Rashford an MBE, number 10 had initially rejected his plea for it to keep paying for £15 a week food vouchers for some of England's poorest families over the summer, only to cave in amid a public outcry. Here ends the article. Now for my own reflections. I am not a Christian, but I understand Christianity because I am a conservative. Much like the line above from the Gospel of Matthew, another biblical phrase, "My kingdom is not of this world," recognizes a deep truth about the nature of existence which forms the basis of conservatism. It implies the flawed, limited nature of the world and the requirement that, in order to live in it, we are faced by having to make trade-offs between different options that necessarily come at the cost of neglecting other options that might have been pursued instead. This is set against the utopian worldview of the leftist, where the ends always justify the means since the ends are, in their view, literally utopia. The ideas in their head justify any cost, and the curmudgeon reminding them that there are no such things as perfect solutions that do not create deficiencies or other problems elsewhere can be dismissed as reactionary, or more likely nowadays, stupid. Where economics is concerned, the fact that spending inherently limited resources on one thing necessarily means not spending them on something else is glossed over by such mental gymnastics as modern monetary theory, or command economics. Modern monetary theory in particular contains the fantastical assertion that since governments issue their own currency there is no limit on how much they can spend, since there is no need to balance a deficit in spending all the while you can print more money and set rates of taxation, the two mechanisms that proponents of modern monetary theory believe control the amount of money in circulation. Thus, all manner of government spending can be justified purely on the grounds of compassion for the less fortunate, while safely ignoring any sense of fiscal responsibility to either taxpayers or people with a vested interest in seeing currency retain its value, which of course is everybody. Economists have warned us for centuries about the dangers of high levels of government spending. To briefly explain, when governments spend money, they don't usually spend just what they raise in taxes, they also borrow money by selling bonds. When they do this, money is, in effect, created out of thin air by a bank simply declaring that it exists and giving it to the government in exchange for repayment over a set time period plus a little extra, known as the yield of the bond. This new money is then spent into the economy. Now, what does the law of supply and demand tell us about the value of something when its supply increases but demand for it stays the same? It reduces in value, and we call this effect inflation. Inflation refers to the effect of prices going up because over time, as the amount of money in circulation increases with ever more government spending and therefore creation of money, individual units of money are worth less relative to what you want to buy. If the government spend too much money too quickly, they can reach a tipping point where money becomes so devalued that it becomes practically worthless and stops functioning as a medium of exchange, which leads to economic collapse. This is precisely what happened in Germany in the 1920s and more recently in Venezuela in the 2010s. Modern monetary theorists contend that you can get around this by taxing money back out of the economy by increasing the tax rate. However, there are two key problems with this. The first is a well-known phenomenon in economics called the Laffer curve, which shows that higher tax rates do not necessarily increase actual tax revenues, because if taxes are set too high, people will either tend to avoid paying them, or simply not bother trying to generate any extra income due to the high tax rate, reducing the incentive to make money. This significantly hinders the ability of the government to raise the taxes they need to control inflation, because if they can't remove the money they need when they need, their whole scheme comes to nothing, and the risk of high inflation remains. The second issue is that the government do not directly control the amount of consumer and business borrowing in the economy. This creates money for the same reason that government borrowing does, and is only indirectly controlled by governments by their ability to make central banks set a base rate of interest, or in other words to indirectly influence the amount people borrow by making it more or less costly to do so. Governments are stuck in a bind when it comes to base interest rates, because if they set them too high to curtail private sector borrowing and thus creation of new money, it makes their own borrowing too expensive. The alternative is to make the interest rate low to facilitate their own borrowing, but then this has the effect of increasing borrowing in the private sector, thereby creating more money and increasing inflationary pressure. They are damned if they do and damned if they don't. But aside from this catch-22, the chronically low interest rates we have seen in recent years, due to high levels of government spending and thus need for cheap borrowing, are also bad for lots of other reasons, primarily because they tend to encourage economic bubbles to form and worsen the cycle of boom and bust when large amounts of people and businesses, tempted by the low cost of borrowing that low interest rates represent, take out loans that they can't really afford. Then when the time comes and these people can't repay their loans, we are left with large numbers of defaults that cause a cascade effect throughout the whole economy, which is largely what happened in the 2008 crash. The weakness of modern monetary theory in practice is thus revealed by the lack of ability to control what happens to all this new money once it is out there in the world. The government has a very imperfect and unpredictable level of control. It could perhaps be summed up as the difference between driving a car and riding a horse. That horse is a living thing with a mind of its own. So much for modern monetary theory. What about the command economics and socialism advocated by the extreme left? In the strictest sense, what we mean by socialism is state ownership of the means of production of the economy, and command economics is state control over economic activity. Rather than allocating resources through markets, socialist command economies are an attempt to allocate resources according to need, which is to say need as judged by the best guess of a production committee or a price-setting bureau as to precisely what that need is. By producing in line with this arbitrary quota, they can afterwards conveniently claim to have fulfilled that predetermined need, which of course need bear no relation to the actual demand. The largest economy that used this economic model was the Soviet Union, where combinations of shortages and paradoxical gluts were commonplace, due to those in charge of the Soviet economy making very imperfect guesses and estimates about what to produce with whatever the Politburo allowed them to have. First-hand accounts of this are striking. Perhaps the most visceral I have read about the day-to-day reality of how the Soviet economy functioned can be found in Peter Hitchens' book The Rage Against God, where he details his experiences of living there. But Soviet economists themselves have gone into great detail about the dysfunctional nature of both socialism and command economics. Nikolai Shmolev and Vladimir Popov discuss these problems at length in their critique of the Soviet economy in their book Turning Point, Revitalizing the Soviet Economy. The precise reason for their shortcomings will be discussed later on, but suffice it to say for the moment, it essentially involves very imperfect guesswork. Both modern monetary theory and command economics are an exercise in concealing costs rather than facing up to them. By either fulfilling our needs by arbitrarily deciding what those needs are ahead of time, as is the case with command economics, or by pretending that funds are inherently limitless, as with modern monetary theory, both approaches sidestep the whole issue of having to make imperfect trade-offs and the costs they necessarily involve. In the most basic sense, they either pretend that resources aren't limited, as with modern monetary theory, or simply declare that whatever there is at any given time is enough, as with command economics. The appeal of these economic models to the political left now becomes apparent, because both are essentially a rubric that gives one both the justification and practical ability to make the ends justify the means, for how else does one unfailingly make this mental leap without tacitly ignoring costs? As such, the imperative of creating an ideal society requires the tacit assumption that costs can and should be ignored, and that ideal solutions to problems can ignore the painful choices about how to spend inherently limited resources, for were it not so the utopian left would have to admit that such a utopia is an impossibility. Unfortunately for us all, it is demonstrably the case that resources are indeed inherently limited, since otherwise there would be no reason for an economy in the first place. This idea may sound a little strange at first, but consider a world in which everyone already has everything they want and need. In this world there would be no point in buying or selling anything, including your own labor, hence no reason to work other than for pleasure. The reality of inherently limited resources is expressed in economics as the concept of scarcity. Scarcity is defined by Dr. Thomas Sowell in his magnum opus Basic Economics as, what everyone wants always adds up to more than there is. A world in which there is perfect equity and equality between people in the economic sense is one where everyone's wants and needs are fully satisfied, i.e. a world in which difficult decisions about how to spend resources, given the fact that you only have so many and have to choose what to spend them on and what not to, don't need to be made. The entire concept of costs becomes an irrelevance. There is no need to take costs into account or prioritize spending on one thing over another if there is more than enough for everyone's needs and wants to be fulfilled. This imaginary world of endless abundance is a condition referred to by economists as post-scarcity. It is an idealized fantasy world that bears no resemblance to the one we actually live in, and nor could it. Our existence by definition involves making trade-offs, since we leave everything undone that we did not choose to do. We can have an endless supply of carrots only if we farm nothing but carrots. We have all the time in the world if we do nothing but sit on our asses all day. We could end climate change tomorrow by committing the mass genocide of Earth's entire population. For every right you grant a person, you impose a corresponding obligation to observe that right on everyone else. To be sure, it is unfair to caricature the political left in this way, when what they really desire is equality and equity between individuals rather than post-scarcity. But even this involves a trade-off they either can't, or won't, admit they need to make, because even if enforced equity could be achieved, it would necessarily involve an imbalance of power due to the impositions necessary to equalize outcomes across radically diverse individuals and fundamentally different cohorts. In practical application, this would assume the form of imposing arbitrary costs on people, usually to forego an opportunity that their greater natural ability could better exploit than other less gifted people. An example of this could be a naturally academically gifted individual passed over for selection at a top university because of an affirmative action quota aimed at increasing racial or gender diversity on campus. The key point here is that this cost is not imposed just on the gifted individual. By following this policy we are also imposing a cost on the wider society because they have missed out on the potential the gifted individual had to contribute, economically or otherwise, to the wider society. When making sweeping judgments about who should be given what opportunity, any questions about the legitimacy or efficacy of policies like this, beyond nebulous platitudes about fairness and fatuous observations of cherry-picked statistical correlations, are seldom asked, much less answered. In order to impose their vision of fairness, the political left must subvert or delegitimize the individual's judgment of what is or isn't valuable in order to ignore or conceal the costs of what they seek to impose, and which the individual may not agree to. What we as individuals perceive as value is derived from the fact that people don't possess everything they want, therefore they make exchanges with other people to obtain it by offering things those other people find valuable for the same reason. Technically speaking, two key figures of early left-wing economic theory, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, introduced a key concept which ever since has been used to ignore or downplay what we as individuals think of as valuable by ascribing it to the function of an objectively definable mechanism, which Marx called the labor theory of value. As a theory, it holds that value can be objectively defined as the sum of what went into producing any given commodity, rather than an individual's perception of value brought about through the subjective judgments of individuals trying to make arrangements with each other to get what they want. Instead of thinking of high value as a function of low supply and high demand, and conversely low value as the reverse, they define value through what any given commodity is comprised of, with the chief consideration going to the amount of labor it took to produce it. In other words, they don't really care about what people actually want and need, and aren't prepared to allow people to make their own judgments about what is valuable and what isn't. You only have to look at how much people paid for Belle Delphine's bath water to understand why the labor theory of value is nonsense, and yet the labor theory of value allows them to assert that when a profit is made on something made in a factory, that profit is value stolen from the workers who made the product because their labor is what produced it, and its value is commensurate with the value of the labor. However, what consumers are prepared to pay for that product given the underlying supply and demand is completely different from what employers are prepared to pay for labor given the underlying supply and demand. Consider a factory where thousands of people labor intensely on large boxes of incredibly intricate mechanisms that do absolutely nothing, and that no one wants. Because of the amount of highly skilled technicians and artisans it's necessary to employ to build these things, the factory's wage bill is enormous, so the value of the labor is obviously very high. Yet when they come to try and sell these useless boxes they make no money at all, because no one in their right mind would buy one. It should be obvious then, that determining the value of something through how much labor went into it is demonstrably false. It doesn't matter if all the labor in the world went into making something that no one in the world wants, its value would be zero because no one would be willing to pay any amount of money for it. However, thinking of value in this way allows left-wing Marxist economists to supersede or preempt judgments that individuals make about how valuable something is, and if you can distort or undermine what people judge to be valuable, then you can conceal or ignore costs. If we think of costs as the compensation of value required to be paid when we exchange one thing for another, then making the value judgments of individuals meaningless or illegitimate is how the left get around their obligation to compensate those from whom they wish to take in order to pay for their grand utopian schemes. In the purely moral sense of the discussion, I am reminded of a passage from Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, widely referred to as Ivan's Challenge, in which the aforementioned challenges one of his brothers to imagine a perfect utopian society built on the unavenged tears of suffering of a tortured and murdered little girl. The question is whether the cost of achieving such a society is worth paying when it is paid by inflicting unimaginable cruelty and wickedness on a defenseless and innocent child. It is fitting that, later on in the novel, when Ivan is implicated in a murder, he ostensibly tries to absolve his conscience of the immense sense of guilt he feels by instilling in another character the belief that, in a world without God, everything is permitted. Dostoevsky's insight here is that the moral relativism of the belief that the ends justify the means is incompatible with any objective moral standard, such as that found in religion. For the utopian leftist, what is right and wrong becomes simply a question of what is convenient or expedient in the course of bringing a vision of utopia to fruition, hence the taste for absolutism and contempt for the rule of law found in any government that takes leftist theory seriously. Therein lies no liberty. To follow one's own conscience, rather a compulsion to accept any cost, even when paid in tremendous human suffering, in the quest for social justice. To the leftist, since achieving social justice is preferable to what they perceive as the unjust status quo, it is taken for granted that their actions, however costly or wicked, are justified because the outcome produced will be better overall. Quite apart from whether or not these interventions actually achieve the results they promise, this mode of reasoning arrogantly self-appoints the left-wing social justice warrior with the power to decide what is just and what isn't without any reflection on why the status quo exists and what might happen when these meddlers take it upon themselves to change it. Usually their explanations of the status quo assume that unfairness or disparities between people are either directly someone's fault, or attributable to the bias supposedly built into institutions, and cannot be explained any other way. After making their sweeping changes, motivated by vanity as much as compassion, leftists are so often subsequently blindsided by negative consequences that they didn't anticipate because they tried to reduce an immensely complicated interconnected system like human society to an explanation so unnuanced, simplistic, and juvenile that it resembles the black or white reasoning of a young child. Their simplistic explanation of the status quo is that it is simply a reflection of a state of affairs agreeable to the powerful. They give no thought whatsoever to the real causes of human inequity, instead resting the whole edifice of their worldview on a dogmatic assumption that disparities are necessarily caused by those in power discriminating against or marginalizing those who are not in power. This assumption is in turn based on an even more fundamental one, that in the absence of discrimination or subjugation the outcomes between groups and individuals would be more or less equal and the world would fit the vision of fairness that the leftist would expect to see. As far as those on the left are concerned, we would all be more or less equally prosperous, intelligent, law-abiding, and long-lived, were it not for discrimination and marginalization, despite the fact that there is absolutely no evidence of this in an inherently unequal world in which the largesse of nature is distributed very unequally. The vicissitudes of fate decided, for example, that Africans, having no real access to navigable waterways on their native continent, would thus find their capacity to ship goods in large volumes severely hampered, thereby never having the incentive or capacity for meaningful trade which could build significant commercial relationships, one of the keystones of prosperity and therefore the advancement of civilization. This has nothing to do with the oppression of Africans by other people, nor can it be blamed on any institutionalized power structure that systematically causes discrimination against them. Conversely, despite horrendous discrimination, marginalization, and an attempt to wholly annihilate them, Jews on average have IQs 15 points higher than white Anglo-Saxons, and significantly out-earn them in terms of median wage. Neither are Jews cherry-picked outliers, the same could be said, i.e. the achievement of success and social power despite rampant discrimination and marginalization, of the Chinese in Malaysia, the Irish in North America, the Lebanese in West Africa, and Indians in East Africa. If discrimination is to blame for retrogression, poor development, and poor outcomes for different groups of people generally, then leftists in general and critical race theorists in particular have some explaining to do. The reality of human relations are very different. People decide on arrangements with each other as best they can, and not only commercial ones, subject to those agreements being enforceable. The leftist, however, sees it as his duty and province to preempt the decisions of the public, despite the impossibility of having the intimate, mundane knowledge of personal circumstances of billions of individuals that guide their decision-making, nor paying any direct personal cost for making the wrong decisions on their behalf, since he lacks access to the direct consequential feedback they experience on his behalf, that otherwise would and should have rewarded the correct decisions and punished the incorrect ones. Returning briefly to the critique of command economies made by Shmolev and Popov, it should now be obvious exactly why the socialist model of using a committee or government department trying to second-guess what people want and need is often wrong and always guesswork. Two examples will make this clearer. Firstly, where consequential feedback is concerned, Red ink on the bottom line of a balance sheet will motivate a business to be efficient and profitable because it is real, incontrovertible, and unavoidable in its effect of putting the company out of business. Yet a taxpayer-funded bureaucratic department has no such imperative, and can be as wasteful as it likes so long as the government keeps funding it, since, unlike the business, they bear no direct, immediate cost for making incorrect decisions that waste money. At most, the wasteful, inefficient department may contribute slightly to the government that funds it being voted out of office a few years down the line, but there is no guarantee that even this will threaten its very existence in the way the existence of a business is threatened by being wasteful and inefficient. Similarly, from the perspective of the impact of intimate personal knowledge, buying carrots would be a waste of money if you have the mundane yet consequential knowledge that your own family is allergic to them. Yet a distant bureaucrat on a vegetable distribution committee couldn't possibly obtain the vast sums of knowledge of intimate personal circumstances that would have guided the decisions of the people who would otherwise have decided for themselves what vegetables to buy for their Sunday roast. It is hopefully obvious which arrangement is more accurate in terms of actual demand, and thus vastly less wasteful, when it comes to the public procuring the vegetables they actually want rather than having this decided for them by an ignorant public official. As Shmelev and Popov noted, vast gluts of products no one wanted, and corresponding shortages of things people were desperate for were commonplace in the Soviet Union. Such was the effect of consumers having choices made for them. This combination of irresponsibility and ignorance is the real key to why sweeping, revolutionary changes that ignore costs so often have disastrous consequences, from 50 years of the welfare state incentivizing the dissolution of the African American family, to famines like those in 1930s Ukraine or 1950s China, caused not by things like war or weather, but by political, cultural, and social upheavals in the name of justice and equality. It is almost as if by their attempt to destroy religion and replace the concept of the divine with faith in human progress, the left have taken it upon themselves to assume their own omniscience, omnipotence, and magnanimity. Ironically, we now see plainly that this is no less of a faith than religion. To once again quote Peter Hitchens in The Rage Against God, the mindset of the utopian leftist is, faith in the greatness of humanity and the perfectibility of human society. The resemblance stops there, however, replacing deference and humble acceptance of the inherent limitations of humanity and the world we inhabit with the vain arrogance of one convinced that he has the requisite insight and authority to clumsily rearrange what has developed naturally over an unimaginable time span, to preempt and supersede people's right to make up their own mind and follow their own conscience regarding how they wish to live, and generally to replace what works with what sounds good. With all this in mind, we should return to good old Marcus. A year or so before he advocated for schools subsidizing the food budgets of the parents of its pupils, I once encountered a particularly vapid argument that pointing out trade-offs is so much scaremongering innuendo. This discussion between myself and a young leftist was in the context of providing free school meals, just as the apparently messianic Marcus Rashford is campaigning for now. Since I could not provide definitive proof that providing free school meals was worse than not doing so, I was accused of bringing up painful trade-offs as a way of derailing the discussion, presumably because I take delight at the thought of hungry children. I pointed out that spending money on food to feed the fattest generation of children in human history meant not spending it on books, teachers, and so forth. After all, what is the remit of a school other than educating children? I was then piously reminded by my earnest opponent that this was not a question of a zero-sum trade-off, since potentially feeding what genuinely hungry children there are would yield a positive return on the investment. Of course, he failed to mention any evidence for this despite apparently demanding the same of me in regard to what he saw as my contention. But the crux of the matter, and the point entirely missed by my scoffing detractor, is that I didn't reveal a contention about whether or not schools should provide free meals. I simply asked the question, how many fewer textbooks, computers, teachers, school buildings, etc. you are willing to sacrifice so that you can feed the most overfed cohort of children in British history? I didn't get an answer, because answering this question means admitting that we live in a world that by its nature precludes utopia, a world which the gods gave the dark gift of an inherent, inescapable flaw, that costs are real and have to be paid. Back in November of 2020, after reading about Chancellor Rishi Sunak's spending review and the eye-watering amounts of government debt we have built up as a result of the response to COVID-19, I have come to the conclusion that the UK government are spending